everyone, depending on where you join us from. My name is Brunhilde Verrier. I'm a research fellow at the UCL Institute and Institute for Sustainable Resources, and it's my great pleasure tonight to help facilitate the presentation from my friend and colleague, Anna Pagani. So a tiny bit of housekeeping. We will have like 45 minutes of presentation, and then we will have plenty of time for the Q&A. And ideally, we would like to engage in a lively discussion, conversation, and sort of networking as well. But feel also free to put your question in the Q&A section. Ideally, not the chat. Especially because in the Q&A, you can also upvote for your favorite questions. And otherwise, just don't hesitate to raise your hands and we will go to you from there. The presentation is recorded and will be made available online a bit later. So yeah, just a gentle reminder to mute yourselves during the presentation, but I think everyone that has joined so far has muted themselves. So thank you very much for that. Okay, so Anna Pagani has joined the UCL Institute for Environmental Design and Engineering 2 years ago to work on a project funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation that is addressing issues of housing justice with systems thinking. So it's really a topic true to her heart and values. Her work was noticed by the System Dynamics Society, and she was a keynote speaker at the latest International System Dynamics Conference. And so she will provide now an overview of that work. And at the same time, she is preparing to enter a beautiful new position as a senior lecturer and associate professor at the Faculty of Natural, Mathematical and Engineering Sciences at King's College London. So it will be the loss of UCL on that one. And I see lots of congratulations coming in. So without further ado, thank you, Anna, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Brunhilde. Thank you for this very kind introduction. And thank you everyone for being here tonight from everywhere, different parts of the world, to listen to the presentation of those 2 years of research that I conducted at the Institute for Environmental Design and Engineering at UCL in collaboration with a range of colleagues, but in particular with Nikki Zimmerman, Mike Davis at UCL, and Alex McMillan at the University of Otago in New Zealand. So the audience tonight is quite diverse. There are academics and practitioners, and I have done my very best to try to structure the content in a way that will be hopefully interesting and accessible for everyone. So let's start actually with the title of the research project that I've worked on for the past 2 years. A just transition towards housing sustainability, where system science and architecture meet. The title of this project might not align perfectly with the title of the presentation today. And this is because throughout the project, we learned, first of all, that if we understand sustainability as a way to sustain the provision of housing for all within planetary boundaries, then we need to look at housing beyond growth. And secondly, that achieving housing justice falls within and beyond the responsibility of architects and involves all of us, activists, practitioners, academics. And finally, that systems thinking and participatory approaches that we're going to learn tonight, what actually this means, they can help us along the way in the journey. So most of us, especially those based in the UK, know that the UK and England specifically are going through a very profound housing crisis. We've got 8.5 million people that have experienced symptoms of unmet housing needs in England in 2021. Also, very recently, 17% of English households have been found to live in non-decent homes. Temporary accommodation was identified as a possible contributory factor in the death of 55 children in only 4 years. And all of this is paralleled by an increase in 27% in rough sleeping. And most of the cases actually are occurring in London. So there is a true housing crisis. And this housing crisis is also accompanied by a continuous decline in the provision of non-market social housing, which is a crucial vehicle for good quality, affordable accommodation, and it has been defined as a critical prerequisite for health equity. We move from having a third of the housing stock being social housing at the beginning of the 80s to only 16%. When we adopt a systems perspective, we look at those issues as the top white shiny part of an iceberg: overcrowding, death, non-decent home, rough sleeping. But underwater, there are patterns and trends that have been there over time: disinvestment, residualization, racial discrimination, gentrification, that are produced by structures, by system structures. For instance, the way in which the social housing provision happens and occurs, who are the different actors that are involved, what are their goals. And that's why those system structures are produced by different mental models, the way in which we think that the system works. For instance, what is the role of the government or the role of the market in providing social housing? What are sustainable communities? Are they mixed tenure communities? Are they monotenure communities? Well, the interest, or let's say the focus of my research was indeed on exploring those underlying system structures and the mental models that were generating them. Moving from an understanding of the system and its key systemic issues, an understanding of where we want to go towards, what is healthy, what is sustainable housing, and for whom, and of the knowledge that we need to move from this current system and its issues towards the desired one. But I moved to London 2 years ago, and the social housing system in England has been studied by a plurality of scholars, and for many, many, many years. So how to approach such a vast range of literature and of studies? Well, luckily, exactly when I started, a report was published, the Better Social Housing Review, by the National Housing Federation and the Chartered Institute of Housing. And housing associations, so social housing providers, non-profit housing providers in England at the time, had to respond to the recommendations that were formulated by this review. And this review was showing exactly the kind of complexity the housing providers have to navigate and all the key issues that they need to address. At the same time, however, the focus of the project was on housing justice. And there was something that the Better Social Housing Review was not covering, which was the issue of gentrification, very much discussed in London. And so we added the second publication that was more or less similar level of complexity and richness, looking at the key issues related to gentrification of social housing. And what we did is that we coded the content. So we extracted text from these publications and step by step derived variables. So basically names that summarize the content of the text that we have at hand. And with these variables, we slowly looked at interrelationships between them. For instance, if we look at the size of new dwellings, and the quote associated stakeholders told us that too many one or two bed units are being built to hit development targets, and that there is consequently even more pressure on the availability of larger properties for intergenerational family groups, which we called size of new dwellings. This can lead to overcrowding, which in turn have negative health impacts for tenants. So we can see on the right that the size of new dwellings lead to overcrowding, having an impact on tenants' health. Step by step, coding all of this text, we obtained 6 causative diagrams. So cause and effect structures that link those different variables, showing reinforcing or balancing mechanisms in a system. And these covers issues such as maintenance and repair, resources allocation for new construction or demolition, discrimination, gentrification, displacement, all different kinds of issues that we could see in the social housing sector as extracted from this text. But this text was just a starting point, right? Because we wanted to enrich it through the view of housing associations in London. And that's why we organize workshops, both with the authors of the text that we extracted the variable from, and with 4 medium to large housing associations, confirming and disconfirming linkages and leading to very rich pictures of what these issues actually were and how they were interrelated, giving really a picture of what was the complexity that stakeholders have to navigate. And we obtained maps that look like this, with different colors that show the extent to which it was an input from a housing association, from an author, or whether they were overlapping. I will not guide you step by step into those 6 rich maps, but just give you a flavor of actually what they say. This is, for instance, a map on the allocation of resources for maintenance and repair, retrofit and new construction, showing, for instance, that there are a number of incentives to build in England. Construction and new build is perceived as better quality, for instance, and actually can generate a surplus to reinvest in the maintenance and repair of existing stock. However, at the same time, these different dynamics that we see from the diagrams show how this can also lead to certain disincentives to maintain, repair, and retrofit due to all different factors like the VAT on retrofit, maintenance, and repair, but also by the focus, an increased focus on construction that divert resources and funding from the need to maintain and repair. And this diagram also shows the benefits of maintenance and repair across the system, from an improved void standards to reducing empty properties, more success of tenancies, which eventually would compensate for the issues related to the social housing shortage, which we will call the more fundamental solution. But those maps are not just there to show us how all different issues are interrelated and the kind of dynamics that they trigger, but also to think about possible leverage points in the system. And we thought about some of those, but actually, again, we wanted to learn from participants on what could be possible leverage points in the system, what could be possible interventions in the system. So our maps were a little bit too rich and complex, and so we focused on controversies and reinforcing our unexpected dynamic in the system to produce smaller maps, a little bit easier to navigate, focusing on key controversial points in the social housing sector: maintenance and repair, demolition, physical and social infrastructure, and tenant representation. And we raised some questions to trigger discussion. For instance, what are alternative ways to reacting to government budgetary cuts? How can we hinder the reinforcing causes and consequences of demolition across the system? How can we provide good quality infrastructure for existing communities? Or how can we unlock the agency of local residents in the process? And here again, systems thinking offers us some very useful tools, which are thinking about how impactful and how transformative can be different leverage points in the system. How effective can they be? And I'm going to give you some examples. Well, for instance, we can act on parameters. We can have some land value taxes, more fund for retrofit, tweaking some numbers and constants. We can go a little bit deeper and act on feedback in the system, for instance, having more proactive instead of reactive maintenance. Or we can go a little bit deeper and change the design of the system. For instance, what if we were to include health cost in viability assessments? And even deeper, changing the intent of the system, changing its goal, going from developers' viability to really genuinely providing affordable housing, perhaps up to the level of transcending paradigms, thinking that alternatives to growth models actually exist. So housing associations identified possible places to intervene in the system and discussed about how impactful and how feasible they could be. And if they were highly impactful but little feasible, the question was like how to make them more feasible. And if they were highly impactful and very feasible, why had they not been implemented yet? So we had 4 maps with different levels of feasibility, with different colors that you can see here, and different impact. For instance, again, we're back at the map on maintenance and repair. And here in this map, in order to foster more maintenance and repair as a system that will balance the social housing shortage, housing associations thought about a number of measures. For instance, we can start from having long-term funding for maintenance and repair, tweaking a parameter, having more money, having more funding. Or we can act on the design of the system, thinking about having insurance for tenants to cover repairs themselves. Or we can change the intent of the system by having repair charities and non-profit solutions, or having investors that value social outcomes, ready to take lower profit in return for their investment. Similarly, on tenant representation, here we have a causal loop diagram that shows the linkages between the lack of representation of local residents in management and their exclusion from decision-making. And here we can again act in a shallower way, thinking of having more investment in engagement, more incentives to participation, or really thinking about the models of governance more resident-led and give power rather than trying to work on a deficit to say, we're going to provide more information or we're going to build capacity, as our participants said. So we had those interventions, we knew their impact and feasibility. We analyzed what was the extent to which they were effective in the system by looking at the leverage point and the system characteristic that they were addressing, as we saw before, the parameter, the feedback, or the design or the intent. But also we were interested in understanding the extent to which those interventions were able to produce a different form of value. A value that was oriented towards equality, participation, and ecological sustainability over economic efficiency, accumulation, and expansion. So a degrowth-oriented value. And what we found is that actually, when we look at interventions that produce value through shrinking, slowing, and extending resource cycles, or equalizing inequalities, like having tenure-blind architecture that doesn't distinguish between private homes and social homes, well, we're touching the tip of the iceberg. Instead, if we have interventions that address democratic, purpose-driven, and transparent governance, or overcoming economic growth dynamics, they're going to have the strongest impact in the system, the most transformative one. These are really the roots of the iceberg, the bottom of the iceberg, that eventually is going to have an impact on equalizing inequalities and more ecological sustainability. And as Brunhilde mentioned before, actually, this first part of the study was selected by the International System Dynamics Conference as a plenary session, having probably one of the first time discussing post-growth and degrowth models, finally in the conference that was born out of the limits to growth, so one of the key publications in system dynamics, and having fully qualitative approaches welcome in actually the system dynamics society. But what actually does it mean to overcome growth dynamics? And why do we need to do this? So if we look at our causal loop diagrams, as I was mentioning briefly before, we can see that external funding of different funders helps to build more social housing in England and London, and also more market housing, which eventually creates a surplus to reinvest in more construction, or directly be used for funding for maintenance and repair. However, at the same time, we've been seeing that this focus on building more moves away funding from maintenance and repair, because if the funding is used for maintaining and repairing, at a certain point we will need to build. And to build more, we will need more funding from investors that will eventually create a lock-in on the need to continue construction in order to maintain and repair and to continue building. And this will have a number of consequences across the system, from indeed the funding for maintenance and repair, the quality of the housing stock, the financial pressure on housing associations, the shortage and turnover of staff, eventually impacting again on the quality of the housing stock. And this decrease in quality of the housing stock is also what triggers more demolition, generating more housing shortage, and what also at the same time triggers a certain stigma towards social housing tenants and the provision of alternative housing models like shared ownership housing or intermediate rent to create a kind of a social mixing in social housing estates. And all of those, again, have a number of consequences on residents' expulsion, displacement, and dispossession, creating more stigma, more support for tenants, more financial pressure, and more disconnection with the tenants, eventually, again, impacting on the quality of the housing stock and more need to demolish. So here we see a series of reinforcing mechanisms. But despite demolition and rebuild not really being the way to address the key issues in the social housing sector, it seems like continuous growth is embedded in our politics and our ways of thinking on how to address those issues. This is a screenshot from a post of a few weeks ago from Home England saying that in order to deliver the government's ambition of building 1.5 million homes across this parliament, the housing and regeneration sector will need to build at a rate not seen in a generation. So for those who are not familiar with the English housing context, actually there is this big promise of building 1.5 million homes. So these targets have been oscillating over history, so it is not a full new target, but let's instead look at the behavior of the system. What do data show us? Well, we can see that actually since 1996, we've been having dwellings, that the housing stock in England has grown 14% faster than the number of households over this period. So the surplus housing stock grew for about 70%. So it's quite massive. And this affects in particular England and the Southeast, the regions where we have the largest housing shortage. And if we continue arguing that we need to continue building so that housing prices would actually decrease, well, this has been contested by so many economists, showing actually that the idea that prices will decrease at a certain point is very flawed. It is not such a linear relationship, which is actually being shown by the fact that dwellings creation continue to outpace household formation, and prices still continue increasing while social housing continues decreasing. So it seems like this idea of solving the problem of the housing crisis through more construction and demolition is actually a form of an illusion that continues generating a number of unintended consequences, which can be shown in the way in which the housing market works in London, with more demolition of social housing estates, more densification in order to finance the rebuilding of those social homes, and eventually having all of those new homes sold to foreign investors eventually. So climate movement and environmental and housing justice activists have united in campaigns to fight for refurbish, don't demolish, or to fill empty homes. And actually academics are backing up this idea, showing that actually housing expansion is in conflict with England's ecological targets. And you might have seen appearing more and more, starting from Switzerland, and reaching the UK, this need for a global moratorium on new construction, or questions on should there be a moratorium on new build construction in the UK? Should we just stop building? And so we raised the same question with our housing associations who took part in the workshop. What if to provide more and better quality social housing, there were a moratorium on new house building across the sector? So what if we were to stop building homes entirely in England? So, of course, discussions with housing associations started from concerns around the financial model. How would we be able to finance the provision of social homes? Would we have enough homes for everyone? What about our homes that are actually very poor quality and that we struggle to refurbish? And then the conversation started going instead towards possible architecture and planning solutions that already exist. And so we used basically the insights from our causal loop diagrams, the data that we had available without reinventing the wheel, but just seeing at what other scholars had already published, and the different challenges the housing associations were mentioning to build 7 conclusions of what possibly a moratorium could do. So firstly, a moratorium would challenge the narrative on the housing crisis. We're not questioning the fact that there is a housing crisis, but the way in which this housing crisis is conceptualized, showing again that supply has outpaced demand across England, having a marginal effect on housing prices. So this has been shown by different studies already in 2019, but also more recently by Josh Ryan Collins in this report that was published just 2 months ago, showing that actually we need to address the deep-rooted issues of speculative demand and prioritize housing as a social good over financial gains if you really want to address the housing crisis. So we need to move from building, so continuing construction to afford homes, towards maintaining our homes to be able to inhabit them, a different mental model. Secondly, a moratorium will require engaging with sufficiency and with finity. So we have 1.5 million, funny enough, the same number as the new targets for homes, 1.5 million unoccupied dwellings in England, including vacant and second homes. And among those that are actually fully occupied, a recent study has been showing that actually only 50% of the bedrooms in England are used to meet housing needs. Another 25% are spare, the first spare bedroom, we might use it as an office or something else, but 17% has 2+ spare bedrooms. So here we're seeing that there is also an issue across the sector in terms of distribution and justice. And a study actually by a colleague at Leeds has been showing that we could stop entirely building by 2035 without reducing today's living floor area per capita. Actually, we can achieve within the carbon budget an increase of living floor area per capita to 40 square meters per person. Instead, if we were to just meet the targets that are set by the government, we will have doubled the cumulative emissions. Third, a moratorium could prompt the implementation of innovative solutions in design, planning, and management. We could think about so many solutions that have already been proposed. What about an exemption from a share of capital gain tax when we sell for social rent? A community right to buy, so giving power to community to appropriate those empty homes. Having a government-funded empty homes program to be able to refurbish empty properties. Abolishing what is still here in England, which is the right to buy, so the possibility to buy social homes and take them away actually from the hands of housing associations and local authorities, so stopping this loss of the social housing stock. Or having multi-generational and intergenerational housing solutions, which we can observe across Europe, and I'm sure that many people in the audience today are familiar with. And perhaps meet what housing associations shared during the workshop, seeing them a non-profit housing provider moving from private developers, as they have to be right now, to the best housing managers. Fourth, a moratorium could challenge the idea that building new means building better and for everyone. This is very entrenched in our mental models. In fact, during the workshop with Housing Association Concern, we shared about the maintenance and repair of the existing housing stock. What about the housing stock that comes to an end of life, dysfunctional architecture that has been built years ago, all different advantages of new builds. But at the same time, evidence have been showing that retention and upgrading of existing housing stock is environmentally, socially, and economically better. Of course, we need to take into account possible limitations. So in order to avoid perpetuating existing inequalities. So for instance, what about the geographical location of empty housing? But what is interesting is that you'll be surprised to see that more than 20% of empty homes are actually in the city of London. And other cities like Cambridge have also been found to have ghost enclaves, so more than 20% of empty homes. And more generally, perhaps the profession of the architects and engineers and in general built environment experts will become that of building reparative works and resource stewardship, like Charlotte Malterbart suggests. Fifth, that a moratorium would require redesign of the current business model of housing provision. So we could think about permanent social cooperative or community land trust that help to retain rather than capture the social and use value of land. But implementing these models will also require alternative measures of value creation that account for cross-sectoral benefits and prioritize health and well-being for all within planetary boundaries. In fact, what about all the health benefits that housing brings? How can we calculate them? How can we bring them into calculation? Six, that a moratorium would engage stakeholders in thinking and designing systemically. So starting from what are the systemic issues in our sector, where do we want to move towards, and what kind of transformation are needed, supporting decisions on the conditions of systemic transformation that we will need to start building again in the future. And finally, as a last point, we need to understand the moratorium as part of a broader project of transformation. Because of course, if we think about alternative initiatives in an unchanged growth-driven system, we could think about permitted development rights. So the conversion of offices into homes that has had catastrophic consequences on the health and well-being of residents, or the bedroom tax, taxing only social housing tenants, who are actually the tenants who have issues of under-occupancy, who are the least affected actually by under-occupancy. So we need to think about different systems within which a moratorium would happen, moving from justice, efficiency, satisfaction, deurbanization, demonetization, and the whole broader system of degrowth transformations. So I've been showing you some key issues in the social housing system through the lenses of workshops with housing associations. We've been discussing about possible interventions aligned with a degrowth agenda and about the possibility of stop building entirely to achieve agreement on possible radical policies to transform our system. However, I think that most of the people who are here today know that the housing system is a battlefield. And we need to engage with tensions and disagreement and incommensurate values that are there across the system. In fact, all actors beyond housing associations, be it architects, be it residents, activists, see just a bit of the elephant. It's a fan, if it's a spear, it's a snake, it's a tree, but the elephant is actually the social housing system. How to understand such a system? So I did about 40 interviews with academics, consultants, housing associations, developers, architects, policymakers, residents, and also medical doctors in order to generate causal loop diagrams together about their understanding of the key issues in the social housing system in England. This helped us understand the current context and their mental models. Often when we look at regeneration projects, we see decisions that have been taken maybe 20 or 30 years ago, but mapping their mental model today help us understand the way in which the actors that are involved in the process are thinking about the problem. Terminology, we might mean very different things when we say sustainable, healthy, or affordable. The perceived agency and goals of actors, what is my power in the system and what is the power of others? Tensions, synergies, and trade-offs between the different ways of understanding the issues in the system. And the different system boundaries. So where does the system end for each of the people who were interviewed? What goes beyond us? And we color-coded this map in different ways. I will just show you two examples. We could observe, for instance, tensions between different understandings of health, and in particular, regeneration and health. We had some participants, for instance, stating that residents are going to have inconvenience at times and disruption, but hopefully at the end of it, they're going to be happier with their new home. So regeneration understood as a goal, as a final goal that will bring better quality housing and health. Similarly, housing associations saying that regeneration can be a tool that improve the quality of communal areas, cultural sound design, or an architect saying that we can reduce car usage, have better quality spaces, more green spaces. But regeneration can also be understood as a process with negative effects on health. For instance, a resident saying we would have layers of dust and dirt, we will lose trees, we will lose green spaces. An academic saying that actually the regeneration process and plans change all the time and promises change along the process. And similarly, a developer saying it's very hard for us to take into account the whole process and benefits because we just count profit phase by phase. Different understandings of what sustainable means, and in particular on whether refurbishment is better or not than demolition. Having housing associations saying it's not an easy right or wrong about refurbishment or replace. If you can't densify it, then where's the money coming from? Having a developer saying, well, of course, it might be that demolishing a rebuilding is better from an environmental perspective, to be questioned, but this on the basis that new building is to the higher quality, and this is often compromised by a corrupted system. An architect saying, well, it's a matter of social justice. We need to continue building because we have a need for homes. Another architect saying, well, it seems like it's to the benefit of the local authority to demolish homes in order to meet housing targets. A resident, again, feeling that we feel like we must be housing and that we're in the way of progress because we're made to feel that way. We need to leave our homes. And an academic finally saying, well, it might be that eventually alternative housing models like cooperatives or community land trust will choose to demolish and rebuild as much as the market will do. But the point is that it will be the choice of the tenants. So different voices, different understandings of the system structures that are behind what healthy means and what sustainable means. And eventually what we see are different truths. But those truths seem to show housing associations trying to survive the thunderstorm, government constantly cutting funds, an arms race between the private and the public sector to provide social homes. The private sector having kind of those evil masterminds very powerful and tenant organizations fighting hard and fighting back. So it really emerged as a true battlefield. And I report this quote from this developer saying, it's a shared problem. Shareholders, funders, everybody got to serve somebody. And we all sit back and say to someone else, somebody else's problem to solve. But we're not going to get anywhere because we're denying ourselves the agency we actually have. Everybody gets beaten by the system. And I genuinely think that, yes, they're terrible a number of times people, terrible a number of times developers, but they're also a product of the system as much as they're culpable for creating it. So intervening beyond growth and providing healthy and sustainable housing seems to go against a lot of beliefs. And we need to actually confront a plurality of mental models and different truths on what sustainable means, on what healthy means, and the system structures that are behind us. So throughout this research, I had moments of profound disempowerment. However, I've also learned that research and participatory research can help us along the way, because research can be a truly transformative and empowering process if we move beyond an extractivist practice. So in the concluding workshop of this research, we engaged with a plurality of research participants and beyond to use the different interventions that housing associations had proposed in order to develop strategies together and think about who should be held accountable and how we can actually implement those strategies. We discussed about a house building moratorium, thinking about who should be involved, what we should do, what are the possible next steps. And we brought everyone together to play the role of somebody, to step into the shoes of somebody else, using the different systems maps that we had developed with different stakeholders and trying to create a common ground, try to dialogue with each other, create a platform for discussion. And research can do this. It can help think of strategies. It can help design possible solutions and radical solutions, and it can help build common ground. And the feedback that we received along the process was, for instance, that there are practical changes that we can make, that the research can challenge or disrupt the way in which things are done. That there can be that housing associations felt like there were opportunities to actually be challenged and prompted by peers and to learn about the interrelated challenges that really affect the provision of and regeneration of social housing. That it helped reflect on the received wisdoms that drive a lot of decision making, to the point that actually before joining the workshop, they thought that growth and quick growth would always be good. But actually, if you take a step back, maybe growth that fast is not always good, or it can be detrimental to other things. And in the final workshop, learning that actually participants felt less scared of radical change and actually were able to focus on what is best to do, not what feels the most possible. And especially that they learned that post-growth change is possible. This happens in all kinds of events where we've been trying to engage, receiving feedback that participants felt that they were looking at social housing in a different light from that moment, or that actually issues cannot be solved just by working in silos, and that we need this kind of provocative interventions. And that's why I think that we all need to take a stand. That research is inextricably linked with activism, and we need to engage outside the realm of academia in discussions around the way in which we believe that we could provide a better world for everyone to live in. So to conclude, I took you on a journey from systems knowledge on what generates the key issues that we see in the social housing sector in England and the different perceptions of the system structure that create interconnected issues in the sector. On what do we want to achieve, seeing that sometimes some goals like viability or health or sustainability, retrofit, demolition, financing can be prioritized over other, that terminology can be very different, and that also the perception of agency can be very different across sectors. We've been thinking about how to provide possibly homes for all, and that systems map can really be a form of evidence that is complementary to data. We do need data, but we also need to understand how this is interlinked with many other issues. We've been seeing that actually the most transformative ways of acting in the system are those that affect different types of governance and alternatives to economic growth. And that research in this process can really trigger transformation. That we can think about possible counterintuitive policies aligned with systems goal when we use systems thinking, and especially that change is possible as it occurred throughout the process. Change is possible if we approach research as a process and as an exchange, if we engage with humbleness and curiosity, if we try to overcome communication barriers between actors across the sector, and to raise understanding, but also meaningfulness of the system interrelationships that we're trying to look at. And especially if the research would eventually empower stakeholders to raise, but also to address the systemic questions that they're raising and support a shift in the system. So I'm going to continue this research at the Department of Engineering at King's College London, where I started working actually yesterday. And I thank you very much for listening. I'm looking very much forward to all the questions, but I also want to thank all the people who joined this research, all the participants that devoted so much time and effort in developing causal loop diagram together with me in the interviews, but also in thinking about possible leverage points, the housing associations that worked with us in really challenging their mental models and responding to the challenge of stopping building. And also all the people who gave me a lot of feedback and a lot of inspiration across the process at ID and beyond ID, in our system dynamics, social and beyond. So, and of course, the Swiss National Science Foundation for funding 2 years of complete freedom in research, being guided really by the need of stakeholders. I think that this is something very important to say, that through the funding I really had the opportunity to respond to the need and feedback of the participants of the research, making research goals and methods evolve throughout the process, which is quite quite rare for funding bodies. So thanks a lot, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Anna. I don't know if you could see, but there were a lot of claps and congratulations and a few heart-shaped emojis as well. So thank you as well for a very clear presentation on so important subject and being brave and push the boundaries and challenge our mental models. So fascinating. I have seen that we already have some questions in the Q&A, so I will again encourage everyone to either raise their hands or put in the chat, put in the Q&A section. And in case I start to read your question in the Q&A, that's just because I assume that potentially you put it because you want me to read it, but please do feel totally okay to jump in case you want to voice your question. Also, please feel free to put your cameras on even if you don't speak. So that would be lovely to see you. Okay, so I will try to go to the Q&A because I don't see a hand already raised. So I will go to what we have already. So let me see. Okay, so we have a question from Sam Lee. I see a few hands being raised. I will start then with that for a question. So this is an excellent presentation, Anna. Are there other funding models that you've come across that could help support the work, or is that too early to determine this at this point?
Thank you very much, Sam, for this.
No. Not at all. No, I also personally wanted to say congratulations, Anna. It's so inspiring to see your work always. But it's probably worth saying I posed my question when you were talking about the moratorium. Am I saying
moratorium?
It
Yep.
Moratorium. And specifically about that work, I was just thinking about the conversations that may have happened during those workshops and whether there was talk about how sort of like within the system the funding would work.
Yeah.
So just to kind of pad out that question a little bit more.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I'm going to respond, but Eleanor, I saw that you raised your hand. Was it related to that, or because if it's related to
it was actually yeah. Ella Warwick, one of the participants from a housing association in some of the workshops here. Again, really want to sort of congratulate Anna, not just on the work, but the way that she has genuinely engaged and followed the sort of like the questions and the processes which we've been going through. Sem, the reason I leapt up with my hand with that point, because part of the journey, it was incredibly refreshing to reconsider this whole moratorium, this urge that we have to be able to build ourselves out of the housing crisis, and all the things from the Mayor of London with the London plan that good growth is the only way to do it, but actually we don't have a definition of what good growth actually means, and we really sort of struggle with it. I think there was this huge sort of like sense of excitement and relief and a lot of conversation in the workshops about where housing associations would sort of like reallocate. It was a lot of it was about reallocating resources sort of like to existing buildings. It was actually, that was the thing which was really, really exciting and refreshing. I think the challenge in looking at other models is it feels like we are now going through almost a natural experiment where this has happened. Anybody who works within the housing association sector will actually sort of like know how much housing association pipelines have slowed down because of construction material and labour insurance, all of those things which are there. And the real struggle that we are facing with this target of 1.5 million homes is this vicious cycle has already sort of like started up. We don't have the people, we don't have the ability to scale up, we don't have the skilled staff. And I think the bit about Anna's work, and this is my question for Anna, is how do we not waste this opportunity for a breather, this opportunity of what is naturally happening? How can we encourage and bring people along to be able to say, in the same way as some of the things about the pandemic were an opportunity to rethink things? How do you get people to think differently if they haven't been through this process for the last 2 years?
Yeah, that's such a good question. Thank you both actually for raising these points, and I'm going to reply to both. So, as Eleanor correctly said, so basically what we see is that it's mainly a way in which resources are allocated. So since you create this kind of reinforcing loop in which you continue depending on new funding to build, and those new funding will help you also to maintain, but then eventually you will need to keep the promises to build that you made initially. So you will need more funding to build for the promises that you made before. So when you look at the systems maps, you see that actually stopping construction would not be such a breakdown in funding, because the system would eventually self-sustain itself, possibly. We want to look at this numeric quantitatively at a certain point, but from a qualitative analysis of the systems maps, you really can see that actually it's a system that is dependent and self-reinforcing, but you could potentially going towards maintaining to inhabit would be possible. I could enter into the details of the causal loop diagram if we wish, but just let's say that it emerged from the causal loop diagrams and the discussion with the housing associations. And how do we build on this momentum? Well, that's a good question. And that's a question that I would also like to address to everyone in the audience, in the sense that we've been seeing that when we bring stakeholders along, like we did with the housing associations that were involved in the projects, step by step, systems thinking allow you to have that aha moment. So it's not just writing a report, and we've been saying there are so many reports, like the paper on the building moratorium is built based on so many existing reports and data that are available, showing that actually housing construction doesn't make any sense. So of course there is a momentum, there is a window that is opening now, but at the same time the approach is fundamental, and the tools that we have right now, such as consultation, etc., responding to some call for evidence, are one of those, but they do not bring stakeholder along in the process. So the biggest need will possibly to be to engaging different kinds of stakeholders in similar activities, up to the point in which through systems thinking they manage to have that aha moment, like, aha, this is this systemically, this doesn't make sense. And there is perhaps other 2 points. One is also it needs, of course, to be demonstrated that what will be possible effects across the whole chain of the construction chain, which is what would be my interest for continuing this research. And I had something else in mind that now is sleeping, sorry. But like well, it just escaped my mind. Yes. Well, anyways, another way would really be to try to show that what would be possible effects across the process. That would be also very important, because it's one of the criticism also that I often hear related to. But yeah, there is momentum right now. There is very important. Yeah, and that's the other point. Sorry, and then I stop. It's just to say we can respond to that target of 1.5 million homes, because if the target is we need to provide 1.5 million homes, we can provide them. But the question is, do we need to build them? I think that's the question, right? So 1.5 million homes, we can provide them, but do we need to build them in order to provide them? I think that would be the thanks. It's an excellent question that I think I will leave open still to react. Yeah, Brunhilde.
Yeah, I'm just admitting someone else in the lobby as well at the same time. So I was actually about to read Richard's question and then go to Dan, but I see that Richard has put his hand up. So Dan, is that okay if we go to Richard, because I was about to go to his question anyway, and then to you next? Is that fine? Okay, yeah, let's go with that. Thank you so much. Okay, so Richard, then I'll let you voice your question.
Yeah, thanks, Brunhilde, and thanks, Anna, for that presentation. I took the liberty of asking 2 questions. We'll ask them one at a time. Won't hog the mic. My first one was around, I think you picked it up on it just after I asked it, and it related to spatial distribution of the 1.5 million empty homes the papers you cited had found. And I guess I'm wondering especially whether you've seen anything in the literature relating to how the distribution of homes relates to the distribution of net job creation over the past decades as a sort of way of relating economic and spatial distribution of, or spatial distribution of economic activity with housing demand?
Yeah, thank you for this question. So the study that I cite is a study that has been done by Atkinson and colleagues, and it's actually I recommend everyone to look at that report, because you have the maps, the geographic distribution of empty homes across the UK actually, and the maps are, you can access them, you can download them and see each map for each local authority. So it's quite an excellent study. And so they focused in, and you can see these ghost enclaves, etc., their geographical distribution. But their research then mainly points to coastal areas, showing that, and they did also a qualitative study on the top of that, that basically shows that those areas, due to the big presence of second homes, have also lost all the social interactions. Most probably, it's, again, I unfortunately do not have the data at hand, but most probably I would say also jobs, because if you have a predominance of second homes in certain areas, then you only have people who come there for holidays. So I remember this quote saying that, for instance, pubs are empty, like life is not that is not there anymore in certain areas. But then if you think about the city of London, then it's very different. You know, they're bought by international investors, and you've got, I found that wrong, 27% of homes are empty there. So it's like quite a large percent. So it would change geographically. I would need to have a careful look at whether they also looked at jobs, and I can pop in the chat, or at the end of the session I can pop in Teams the link to that study. Yeah, and but also I think they would be super happy if you were to get in touch with them, because they've been working on that quite hard.
Oh, sorry, Richard, you had a...
I think you said the authors were Atkinson and Josh Ryan Collins?
Atkinson and it's no
if it's
Born.
okay.
I will send it. It's I know the group, and Rafaela, and I will send that. It's a report from the University of Sheffield together with UCL. So it's yes, thank you for sharing that. Thank you.
So we'll go to Dan, and then I see that there are questions in the chat, so I will catch up on that, but the next will be from Graziella. So, but Dan first.
Thank you very much, and again, congratulations, Anna. This is and the rest of the people involved. It's absolutely brilliant work, and the level of thinking and depth and engagement throughout the process is really to be absolutely applauded. I work at an organisation called Dark Matter Labs, and we are interested in systemic issues. And my background, I've spent the last 25 years in housing, I built social housing, I've been involved with regeneration, a range of different projects across the years. I work for housing associations, etc. And I want to say two things really. One is that we're about to start an interesting piece of work which is incredibly linked to this, and I want to invite people to get involved and or get in contact if they're interested in, or they've got an interesting perspective, which is looking at exactly this question of affordable housing within planetary boundaries. That actually is the exam question, and working with some UCL colleagues like Josh Ryan Collins and Arup on this work. And one part of the work is to build a sort of taxonomy of tactics that can deal with some of these challenges which cross those two areas. So this work you've done is just, is absolutely amazing and brilliant. I want to, so the invitation is there. Do get in touch, and we definitely need to have a chat. I want to just pose a slight, maybe a slight challenge, just to some of this, just because I think it's helpful sometimes to have alternative perspectives put in. And one is, I think, is that I think there's an issue, I think, about, as you say, about distribution. This isn't an issue of absolute numbers of distribution. However, having said that, though, there's a strong argument, I think, that households haven't been forming in the UK because of affordability issues and other broader shifts in society, but particularly affordability issues. And so to sort of map the number of homes versus households could be seen as quite simplistic. And the second point I want to make is that last year, the UK, we had a 750,000 net migration figure. This year will be something similar. If climate change is, the impacts of climate change are going to be very serious, as we know, and it's quite likely that migration will carry on in some shape or form, for some time. And so the growth of population and therefore households is not going to be insignificant. I just wanted to know if you thought about some of these factors within your work, and also long-term demographic shifts, which perhaps go the other way of like lowering birth rates, etc. Because obviously houses last for hundreds of years often. So I'm just kind of interested in that kind of longer term and more demographic perspective.
Yeah.
But again, well done.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thank you. And this is actually an excellent question, because it is one of the obstacles that was raised during the conversation with housing associations. It was actually nearly one of the first. It was about population growth. And I think that what you mentioned about household formation, it's a little bit the chicken and egg question, right? Like, so if we have more housing, then we have more household formation. Because one of the questions would actually be, for instance, when I was doing at the time my PhD in Switzerland, one of the key issues that we were seeing is that we had more and more households, and housing cooperatives in Switzerland, they are very large, and they manage under occupancy and over occupancy. And what they did is overcrowding. What they did is that they encourage households when they shrink to move to a smaller apartment, but they didn't have sufficient small apartments for all of those households that were becoming smaller households. So even if there was the possibility to move around, they had that issue. And that's why they started thinking about cluster apartments, where you have instead smaller units and larger kitchen that are shared and amenities that are shared. So that's why kind of the architectural innovation is extremely important in there, because it's like, how do you actually still allow households to form that you have available? And I think that that's where the study that our colleagues at Leeds have done, they had within the quantitative model, they had the assumptions of population growth. I don't remember exactly what those assumptions are. I'm in touch with them, and so I could go back to them to see exactly what those are. But they had population growth assumptions embedded in the model, showing that we could still achieve 40 square meters per person. So it was not in terms of how many households there were, but it was really in terms of square meters. And there you have that freedom in terms of architecture and design, in rethinking, how are homes shaped, and how could they accommodate within the existing building stock the formation of households, but also a different way and less individualistic way, perhaps, of understanding what a household is and how a household lives. So that would be one point. Actually, at the time, my PhD was indeed on reducing housing size, still protecting the health and well-being and wishes of its residents. And similarly, I think that this counts both for household formation and for the demographic shift. But I want to add one thing about the I want to say democratic at all prices, the demographic shift, hopefully, which is that a moratorium is also a temporary intervention. That's the difference as it comes actually from the way in which Charlotte Malter-Barth also started kind of this idea. But so it's this idea of a pause, right? So then it's also a way of rethinking then the whole way in which we provide homes and how we provide them and how we restructure our homes. So that's why I would we need to play with different time horizon in order to think about this. Possibly think about short-term, medium-term, and long-term, and through the long-term thinking, how long a moratorium would need to be to accommodate different population growth trends. So that would be my answer to this. But thanks for raising these questions. And I look very much forward to continuing discussing this with you and Dark Matter Labs and everyone involved. So thanks for raising this. We will chat.
Graziella was next.
Yeah, hello, good evening to everybody. So Anna, thank you for the invitation and thank you for sharing this wonderful insights and study. So my question is about how to how we can make this experience more international, because you were building already on the results of your first studies in Switzerland. And my question was about the involvement or engagement of the structured networks like EFL, the European Federation for Living, that I've been following for, let's say, 7 years in this moment, or Housing Europe. I represent a developer, a private developer tonight. So maybe under a certain perspective, you can perceive the developer as the evil or the devil, because we take profit from building, of course. And as a developer, but really take care of the community. The thing that I say we are different is not just because we operate in emerging countries like Brazil, India, soon Colombia, but because myself, I was educated in Politecnico di Torino, and I also hold a PhD. And what I did the first time that I came to lead the research corporate function within a real estate developer is that I established a scientific committee, because I want to take the relationships with the academia. So summarizing back, my question is, isn't it the right moment to gain the momentum, the right moment to compare what is happening in UK with what is happening to the rest of Europe? And as far as I know, according also to McKinsey report from 2014, but also to UN Habitat data, if you take those 1.5 million people in need in the UK, it's roughly 1.5 billion households in need in the whole world. So because there are that much people and households living in non-dignitous conditions right now. So what you did in UK can really be took and seen from a more international perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I see that also Dan wants to jump in. Would you like to jump in now? Because I read in a comment, make a comment on European questions.
Only Anna, after you.
Okay, thank you. So thanks so much for sharing this. And I think, well, it's really, that would be fantastic. That would be the idea actually, because this study in parallel with different approaches, but is also being conducted by colleagues in Switzerland. And as you say, wherever we go, we actually grow a little bit our expertise in a certain context. So looking at what could be possible scenarios for Europe would also be, of course, fascinating. However, as housing scholar, I continue learning more and more that each system has its very, very strong specificity. So the approach adopted, the systems approach and participatory approach, and the possible way in which we could approach these issues through degrowth lenses and post-growth lenses, these can be reproduced and can be, of course, applied to many, many, many different contexts, even in contexts where degrowth might sound completely counterintuitive, like the Global South, because indeed the goal of degrowth is to reach health and well-being within planetary boundaries across the globe. So for that reason, through those lenses and the approach adopted could, of course, be applied to different, but from there to build conclusions on what are the current contexts and whether a moratorium would or would not apply to different European countries, well, I would say that it would, but I would need to be very comfortable with actually the system that I'm looking at, and the specificities of the housing system are really. At the beginning, when I moved to London, I was often going to the GLA, the Greater London Authority, saying, but in Switzerland we have housing cooperative and we do this and that. But in Switzerland this is possible and this is happening. But in Switzerland this, and at a certain point the GLA was like, we are not Switzerland. They're like, we are not Switzerland. Our system is different. Our politics are different. So there is these constant tensions, of course, and these different systems that have the whole historical perspective on how and whether social housing was financed, was cut, was prioritized, who had the power, etc. They're extremely different across countries. And well, this would definitely be the starting point for a bigger EU fund that to explore this, and that's where hopefully we could move to next. So, and then you wanted to just, I'm sorry, Philip, if I'm skipping, I think they just wanted to react to.
Thank you so much. Sorry, Graziella, thank you for the comment. I think, so with the work I was describing, there are other coalitions in other countries in Europe. So one in Germany, one in Netherlands, that are also being funded by the same foundation to do the work. That we're very interested in industry and developers being part of the conversation. And we're looking as an organization to try and create an umbrella function across multiple geographies, including Spain and France, in addition to those other ones. So if you want to have a conversation, then just reach out because we'd love to be part of it. And if you're bringing some interest from your organization, that'd be great.
Juliette has been waiting for a while as well. I know Philip as well. Juliette, I could read your question, but please jump in if you prefer.
Yeah, that I mean, the question was very much, similar to Dan's question about growth and climate refugees coming in and looking in the kind of coming decades and what what's the baseline on prediction, and should there be some housing growth actually just in terms of quantum and depending on those numbers, and if there were I guess how to only build social housing, only build those that are and that being part of the transition, and wondering if there could be something that helps that transition of the two systems. But yeah, but it's really interesting to understand how is the moratorium done. But you've answered a lot of that question already, and
Yeah, no, but thank you. Indeed, it's an excellent point indeed, and I think that's why if we look at the current system as it is right now, what we see is that incredibly inefficient way of distributing space, and that we see that building is not to, for instance, accommodate or let's say not accommodate, but meet the needs of refugees, meet the needs of people who need the most, but it's a speculative machine that works on its own. So it's part, these continuous housing targets are not there for the people who need the most. And if instead we put the people who need the most at the center, we might realize that we don't need to build, but that we need indeed to redistribute, first of all, what we have already, rethink about the layouts of our homes and how they're structured and what does it mean to share, and eventually based on that, be able to be in that position and say, okay, now that we see how space is redistributed, now that we see what we have at hand, now that we see and have invested in the quality of our housing stock, how do we add for additional population flows, etc., etc. And I think that will be the next step, as I was mentioning, going from short to medium to long term in understanding this. But yeah, I think it's an excellent point, and we should definitely continue this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Philippe, do you want to come in?
Oh yeah, I'll jump in. I'm Philip Graham. I'm at University of Cambridge and hang out with Anna sometimes on our sufficiency discussions. This is a completely unfair question, of course, Anna. A brilliant presentation. I totally agree with all the other comments. But how do we find an off-ramp for governments and communities and newspapers and banks and everybody else who is locked into the narrative of we need to just do this thing because this guy told me to do this thing, which is to build stuff. Because as you've already said, every economist in the country pretty much will say that logic doesn't stack up. Everyone on this call is here because we can see other ways of changing the system. But to do the most radical things, such as suggesting more Swiss style, not even Swiss style, more radical collective living, things which work in Switzerland and Germany, which are not necessarily those things, to suggest a moratorium completely and then kind of complete end. There's lots of radical things we can say, but keep saying into the wind. And I wonder whether there's what the sort of off ramp and journey out of this is.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for raising this question, because it's important. That's exactly the point of saying, when I was saying we need to take a stand, etc. It's like, how is that possible that it's been years? There's so much stuff that is published, we've got so much research, etc., but things are not happening. And I think that here the point is, we can have two visions of the word, perhaps compatible, perhaps not, but like, I would see both. I would see like degrowth pushes us, invites us to look at, on the one hand, interstitial strategies. So how do we work within the cracks that are there? How do we play? There are those cracks, and we are going to enter into those cracks. And this is how housing cooperatives started and then eventually entered into those cracks and then expanded. Perhaps also how community and trust are also trying to enter into those cracks and slowly expanding bottom up in a way. For instance, I was teaching students last week. We had 3 hours or 4 hours of lecture on participation, just understanding what it means to really, really do citizen assemblies, to do participatory budgeting, to really think about how do you develop solutions that can be self-sustained without the need for government intervention. You can work that bottom-up way. However, otherwise, another compatible thing that you can do is this process that we've done with housing associations. It was not like that from the start. We did not, Eleanor can testify, we did not approach them saying, we're going to work on a building moratorium. I think there would have been a bit of a moment of, ooh, where are we going? I don't think we're interested in joining. Actually, it was nearly a little bit of a surprise during the workshop, just that sudden question of what if we were to stop building entirely? But what we saw from the feedback questionnaire was from everyone, even the people who were the least open to that transformation. And not transformation because they were academics, because they were activists, but because they had joined the process. And so the question is, how do you bring a lot of people together to join the process? One could argue through citizen assemblies, because they're the biggest thing that you can have. You can involve a lot of people in the process. And this is happening. It's happening across the whole UK. It's happening a lot. However, they always depend on then top-down validation in order to be implemented. So how do you emancipate citizen assemblies from then the need for top-down validation, and you manage to actually just implement what citizen assemblies decide? Or, how do you do this kind of workshops and research that we've done with kind of stakeholders that would unlock parts of the system that need to be unlocked, that will have that aha moment in saying, and that kind of will unlock the system in that way. And again, I think I do have hope, really related. I did not have hope through the project, but I really had hope by seeing that kind of transformation that happened along the project by people who did not join the project voluntarily at the beginning. I did not know where this project was going towards, and that had never heard degrowth before. So, and degrowth was actually never mentioned to them. So,
I wonder whether the word degrowth is problematic. If you can move towards a moratorium and still keep it within the kind of growth conversation. I'm looking maybe at Eleanor here a bit as well, at Clarion, because there's. I'm an architect. The whole point is to do stuff, but if we can do better with what we have and see that as a kind of positive growth of jobs and skills and projects and innovation, it still produces a relative moratorium. It still starts to move away from just building stuff because the model says we have to, but doesn't kind of tie ourselves into an agenda which might be overpowering, if you like.
I think I will respond to that in two ways, because I think it's a good point to raise. So on the one hand, yes, degrowth is problematic. Yes, and why is it problematic? Because it's a word that cannot be co-opted. So degrowth just means degrowth. It cannot be like sustainability that is going to become greening or whatever. It's a word that has its own idea of where we need to go towards. However, degrowth in what exactly? What do we need to grow? Social housing needs to grow. Housing for all needs to grow. We grow as human in terms of well-being, in terms of planetary flourishing, of environmental prosperity, etc. So degrowth is related specifically to processes, and you can decide not to use it. You can just decide to say, we need to have social housing for all within planetary boundaries. We need to have good housing and quality housing for everyone. It's perfectly fine. You can decide to talk about a post-growth world where actually the economy is not at the center, but people are at the center. You will be able to adapt the strategy that is the most effective, and perhaps afterwards have the aha moment, which is what happened with housing associations. So developing interventions, they developed interventions, and then we saw that those interventions were aligned with a degrowth agenda. So these are the interventions that you developed. This is a degrowth agenda. They match, and that's the aha moment. So I think that's of course, we need to be strategic in the words that we use, in how careful we are in slowly engaging people. And that's, I agree, but if you continue using the word growth, the only question would be growth of what exactly? So that's what I would challenge within this framework.
Thank you.
Richard, you want to come back in for a last question?
Yeah, I thought I'd sneak in the last 5 minutes with my second question, because I think, Anna, you almost hinted at it at the end of your presentation anyway, which is whether, or like what your plans are to turn your causal maps into mathematical models in the way that Meadows did in Limits to Growth. And her systems thinking book, Thinking the Systems, and whether, that would enable you to sort of demonstrate you can recreate the system behavior over the past decade, 15 years or whatever, and use it to demonstrate or substantiate or counter some of the skepticism you might meet that a sort of construction moratorium will make things better, not worse.
Thank you for raising. It's great that you're raising all these questions, because to be honest, I think also for those who are attending, it's important. So for those who are not familiar with system dynamics, the maps that you've shown, we can put numbers in there and we can simulate it. And typically what you would try to do is that you would develop a system that tries to reproduce reality as close as possible. That's what would happen. If you were to put numbers in any of the mental models of people that have mapped across the sector, none of those would show reality, because I am what you would call a constructivist scientist. So reality for me is constructed through the different realities of different people who understand the system in a very different way. And also the systems maps that we develop with housing associations are through the lenses of housing associations. So there's still maps of the system that show the way in which the system works, but still according to housing associations. So there might be bits and pieces that, if you were to simulate, wouldn't properly work in numerical terms. But of course, simulation models are important because people can see, I do this and this is going to happen, and potentially, we're backed up by numbers. And this is very important and is valid, and we could do that. But within this research, it was not necessarily the goal. It was really to help people really see the system, see the structure of the system, criticize the structure of the system and validate it. And then it could be that in the next step, we're going to think about some smaller, in my PhD, I did agent-based modeling, so I did a lot of quantity stuff, and a very, very complex, rich model reproducing residential mobility of people in the social housing stock, in the housing stock in Switzerland. But to only notice at the end that actually this was very difficult, very untransparent for participants, and it was a black box, and people were just trusting it because it was complex. And so okay, it shows the numbers, but so let's say it was not the goal here. But I will be, of course, I think at the same time, there are a lot of models already there, quantitative models, like our colleagues in Leeds have done a lot of quantitative simulations showing population growth, showing what it will happen if we were to stop building, showing square meters. So the kind of numbers and quantities, a lot of them are already there. So the systems map are mainly to make the structure explicit to people beyond those numbers, to show them how it works. Thank you.
Great.
Philippe, I believe you may have had another comment. I saw you put something in the chat. Oh no, I apologize. It is Eleanor. But you responded to Philippe, is that it?
Absolutely.
Apologies.
That's all right.
I was like, oh. Okay, so yes, so there is an answer in the chat. All right, well, it's 29, so I believe that it's the moment to wrap up. It was really an excellent conversation. Thank you, obviously, so much, Anna, for that very clear presentation, and thank you everyone who joined, and really also to also see your lovely faces and hear you. So thank you for the lively conversation and for being there with us. Anna, do you have a last word?
Yeah, thank you so much, Brunhilde, for really for sharing so well these sessions. Thanks a lot. Thank you very much, and thank you all for these very good questions, for staying here until the end. Feel free to get in touch with me to continue the conversation. It's not a dot in the end of a sentence, it's just a comma. So we are continuing, and I look very much forward to hearing from you, to see how we can continue, and to move towards the next steps. So thanks so much, everyone, for being here tonight. Thank you.